This is the sixth video lecture on the topic of race and ethnicity. I wanted to make it its own separate one so that I didn't have to speak really, really fast. But in this very last slide, you'll see groups of racial and ethnic groups in the United States. And the big takeaway, so this is probably a little bit dated, it's the numbers, the proportions are no doubt off. But the big point that I want to make about this one, and one of the points I want to draw your attention to, is the relative ratio of these different groups. So the percentages, maybe 65 for European Americans, but at least at the moment, the majority of the American population is still white people, who are descendants of Europeans. And then the next larger group would be people who are descendants of the descendants of Spain. So the Latinx, people from Latin America or Spain who speak the language, who speak Spanish or whose ancestors speak Spanish. Now, again, it's important to point out that this is not truly a racial group, this is an ethnic group. A lot of in the anti-racist we often talk about Black and brown people, or people of color. It is not cool to use the phrase colored. That is not cool, but people of color. And then there is even sort of a branch of anti-racism that says, wait a second, white people are people of color too. It's just that white people have been in the position to declare brown as a color, but white is not a color, and then it becomes this whole sort of philosophical circle, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so then you have African Americans, and the reason that you don't hear me usually refer to Black people as African Americans is a lot of Black people don't come from Africa, nor, since I don't identify as a European American, it seems inappropriate that I should ask someone else to refer to the place that their ancestors 12 generations ago came from. So again, this sort of goes back to that race and ethnic identity should be something that you identify for yourself and not something that I impose upon you. Again, speaking to why I use white, brown, and Black, because that is what people see, right? When somebody looks at us, that is, a race is considered a master status. So, and it is a descriptor of one's appearance the same way I might describe somebody as tall or has gray hair, right, or petite. So I use Black, white, lowercase, right, to describe the way people look, to sort them out. An interesting thing that you can play in your own head is when you're describing a friend of yours, what is the first descriptor that you use? And it is not unusual for a white person to say, oh, my Black friend, before they even acknowledge if they're male or female, right? And so part of my anti-racism identity is I am trying to undo that tendency. And I'm trying to undo the tendency to use their, had to pause for a second, but I'm trying to unuse the tendency to use their race as a master status and to instead to describe them as, an older person, a male or a female or something like that. Okay. So then you have the next largest proportion is, and then William Julius Wilson, who you've heard me quote before, he argues that class is more powerful than race, and there's some debate about that. The next group then would be Asian Americans or Asian people, which is a huge group, right? I mean, you may in your mind think, Vietnamese and Korean, but it's also Japanese, Pakistani, Indian people are considered Asian people, right? It's not just, so it's a very, very diverse group. And my understanding is Asian Americans have their own system of identity and their own system of ranking depending on what generation. So some of Asian Americans may have come during the Korean War, may have come as refugees. Other Asian Americans may have come from Vietnam during the Vietnam War. And so there is A great movie to watch is Crash, and you see some of that play out where one group of Asians is actually taking advantage of another group. So there's a whole system of stratification amongst people who are descendants of the continent. Same thing with Africa. Africa is not, it is the largest continent in the world, and we lump all these people into Africa. And some people from Africa are not black, right? They're white. Okay. Then again, indigenous Americans, the smallest, a point to note from this slide, I would ask you which group of Americans has the lowest social ranking. In other words, which group has the highest poverty rate, the highest unemployment rate, the highest alcoholism, and that would be, or poor social indicators, and that's the Native Americans. Which group is the most highly assimilated? Is what we call the model minority. Those are the Asian Americans. Asian Americans, highest educational attainment rate, lowest rates of poverty, lowest rates of alcoholism, right? Lowest infant mortality rate. And the poorest group are indigenous Americans or First Peoples. During this whole COVID thing, there's been a lot of news about the Navajo, how the Navajo are losing, more people are dying from COVID in the Navajo nation, and it's disproportionate, which, you know, if you're watching the news, they're saying the same thing about Black Americans too. More Black Americans are dying compared to white Americans. More Navajo are dying compared to Black Americans. That's really what this ranking, going back to the chapter on social class, white people are wealthier, then you have Black people, and you have indigenous people are at the bottom, right? One of those patterns, and you see it playing out in terms of who's dying. It is truly a consequence, or life and death is a consequence of your social class ranking of your group, not necessarily of you. And then Middle Eastern was one that was added to another textbook. I don't have any proportions here. And of course, they deal with a lot of, right now, the assumption is if they're Muslim or from Turkey or Iran. I had a student many years ago who we were having this conversation, where are you from? And he told me Prussia. Well, Prussia's not a nation on the globe, but I believe Prussia's Iran. Maybe Iraq. Forget. No. Okay. And then finally, the census now allows us to pick multi-racious, that we are one or two racial groups. I think also on this slide, there's a question on a quiz about naming a white ethnic group, right? So remember, white is race, ethnic group is your heritage. A white ethnic group might be Irish or Polish people would be considered a white ethnic group. What else your book say? Irish, Polish, German, Russian. Because white, remember, race is based on what we see: white, black, brown. That's really about it: white, black, brown. And then ethnic group is your heritage, where you come from, your language, your religion. Also on the slide, before I forget, is this, or what white WASP, which for a long, long time, white WASPs were the wealthiest, old money. If you ever hear that phrase. If you watch the documentary, I believe 1% or Born Rich, they talk about WASP, or what that means. And that stands for a white person who is Anglo-Saxon, and that means you're a descendant of the descendants of Europe, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, which is non-Catholic. So a white descendant of, like, England, Vikings. If you watch Vikings, there's this war between the Anglos and the Saxons, right? European or English, European English, and non-Catholic. That's what WASP stands for. Okay, this is the end of this video lecture and the end of this chapter. Thank you for listening, and look for your final exam exercise very soon. Have a good day.